Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm just going to introduce our final panel of today and offer just very brief introductions to our speakers in order of appearance. I think that definitely the way our discussion is moving in this final panel is towards how disgust may be operative in different ways within perhaps certain kind of nationally or civically constructed situations where the relationship between different groups, that disgust is operative in perhaps in revealing some of those relationships and tensions. I'll just say that for now. I don't want to preempt too much. But our first speaker, Imogen Tyler, whose work's been mentioned at several points today, is a senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster and the author of Revolting Subjects, Social Objection and Resistance in Neoliberal Britain. And she's currently editing Immigrant Protest, Politics, Aesthetics and Everyday Dissent, which is coming out next year. And she's followed by Marie Thompson, who's a musician and researcher currently working in the International Centre for Music Studies at Newcastle University. She's recently submitted her PhD Beyond Unwanted Sound, Noise, Affect and Aesthetic Moralism. She's the co-editor of Sound, Music, Affect, Theorising Sonic Experience, and she also performs individually as Tragic Cabaret and in a band, Beauty Pageant. And then last but not least, Andres Montenegro, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Philosophy and Art History at the University of Essex, where he is also a part-time teacher. His research focuses on contemporary transnational art and psychoanalysis, with a special emphasis on Latin America. So I will hand over to Imogen. Thanks.
Hi, and thanks very much, in particular to Isabel for inviting me here today. So I'm coming from a slightly different place because I'm not coming from an art place than some of the talks that we've had so far, although I'm very interested in aesthetics. And in my recent book, which I brought with me just to plug, it's got a very nice cover, which came out this year, I kind of stage a critique of some of the sort of dominant theoretical histories of disgust and objection in an attempt to kind of reactivate a more combative and revolting strand of theory concerned with the politics of disgust. And I was imagining the relationship between my work in that book and my attempt to do this sort of theoretical work and Isabel's job actually curating the retrospective, in particular the Los Angeles Chicano Art Collective, ASGO. And I imagined that, this is my imaginary of what I thought they would want me to talk about, is the relationship between my work on the politics of disgust and the kind of concern in the exhibition with restaging in 2013, in this context, ASGO's political aesthetic, and in doing, provoking us to think beyond a kind of institutionalisation of disgust in what we might call abject art in the 80s and 90s. And that was something that was referred to earlier. So, by the exhibition, I think, by returning us to ASGO's emergence in a very particular social and economic context of the 70s, and I started thinking when I was preparing this about LA in the 70s and the kind of environmental degradation that was going on at the time in particular. I started reading about the building of the freeways, and the effect of that in the 60s and the way that was being written about at the time and what that did to communities, as well as ASGO's interest in war and terror, Vietnam, and sort of state racism and policing. And this is a context out of which their political aesthetic emerged, and in which for them it seems that disgust emerged in that art. So this is a period which you could describe as a sort of intensive period where a kind of neoliberal market economic politics really sort of starts to become normalised or takes hold in a particular way in the US. So I want to kind of begin by returning a little bit to that period. This is just a quote here from a book talking about LA in the late 60s, which talks, literally about the material impact on LA of the sort of rise of car culture and how certain groups become completely disenfranchised and segregated as a consequence of that. So this is a period when LA has been hailed the ultimate city. And it's a sort of extraordinary period in the rise of car culture, and a period when General Motors was given free rein to destroy California's public transport systems, which was sort of transit and trams, opening the routes to this sort of freeway construction which divided neighbourhoods and transformed in particular the idea of the street as a public place where people would gather, into streets as kind of no-go zones. So it's a site or a point in history over this period that's taking place where there's a struggle over the politics of urban space in LA, which is a kind of class struggle, which takes place, and the struggle takes place in part through aesthetics. It takes place through different types of artists engaging with it, different types of political responses to it. So on the one hand, you get this sort of idea being promoted that LA is the ultimate city, a kind of sci-fi city and the city of the future, and on the other hand you get the sort of disenfranchised, and you get people like James Kunstler here talking about LA marking America's evolution from a nation of main streets and coherent communities to a land where every place is like no place in particular, and where the city is a dead zone and the countryside a wasteland of cars. So I was kind of interested, I got interested in researching this as a context in which ASCO emerged as this sort of generation of artists, this expressway generation as they're described in this sort of context. And the way in which their art became, in part, an art that was about taking back the streets. Art which was a disgusted response to the violence and destruction epitomised by the freeway and by Vietnam and by racialised violence in LA. So it was an art that was kind of shaped, I'm saying, by these sort of social and economic factors. And one art critic writes about how the city becomes a fifth member of ASCO, a constant presence in their works, as scenery, pretext, context and texture, as danger, oppression, segregation and playground, and as a place of potential revolt in the sense of both disgust and revolution. So I'm not an artist, but I'm an academic and a teacher. But if I was an artist, when I started researching ASCO, I was thinking actually I'd probably be an artist a bit like ASCO. I'd probably want to join the collective, because my work is also about the power, thinking through the power of kind of revolting methods and aesthetics. So what I'm really interested in my book is a kind of triple meaning of the concept of revolting to begin with. So that means thinking about revolting in an emotional register or affective register as an expression of disgust. We talked about this today, the kind of the loathing, nausea, to turn away, to recoil from something. But also, I explore in my book this sort of loathing in terms of things like xenophobia against minority communities. But in a political register, revolt also, of course, describes acts of protest and rebellion against authority, insurrections, and movements and expressions of dissent. So I'm kind of interested in this multiple, double meaning. But there's a third meaning of revolt that I think I became aware of when I was writing my book, but also very much relates to what we've been hearing so far today, which is about how we, whether we're writers or artists or activists, also engage those feelings to move others to revolt. So this relates to disgust in the way in which we might try and employ disgust as a kind of method or as a kind of aesthetics in order to get a response of some kind. So we might see that in terms of how on the right, and I'll talk about this in a minute, the political right, and at the moment, certainly it's very much the case in Britain, both mainstream news media and political rhetoric engages precisely in a kind of manufacture of disgust towards certain populations and practices. So we can think of kind of key figures in that at the moment, such as welfare recipients. And that becomes instrumentalised, for example, as a way of cutting or welfare and privatising public services. But I'm also interested in the double meaning. So I'm also interested in how revolt isn't just, or disgust isn't just instrumentalised by the right, but what happens to people who are constituted as the objects of disgust. So if you are produced as that disgusting person, if you are the abject, then how do you work with that subjectification in order to resist it? And how might that be understood as a form of politics? So what I do in the book is sort of stage a series of recent revolts by disenfranchised populations in Britain. And these include the protests of migrants in immigration detention centres who are facing deportation, the ongoing resistance of gypsies and travellers to eviction from their land and homes, and the riots of young people in summer of 2011, and also the impact of disability benefit cuts on disabled populations and how they activate forms of politics. Both artists and activists try and rework the kind of stigmatising constitution of disability in political rhetoric as a resistance. So using these kind of revolts as a guide, and I sort of call them political parables in the book, I attempt to kind of map the borders of the contemporary British state from the inside out. It's a way of kind of re-looking at the state we're in. So what drives the book is this kind of concern with thinking about how we might contest the politics of disgust and how we might think about states of being and states of belonging which characterise contemporary life together by reworking. And the term that I use to do this in particular or develop is this concept of social objection. So this is a kind of a political reading of objection which goes back to Bataille's work and works with post-colonial writers, works with Frantz Fanon's work closely in order to kind of contest the sort of normalisation of abjection from Julie Kristeva's work in particular. So it kind of refuses a particular conservative psychoanalytic account of abjection and instead attempts to reactivate a more radical and social understanding of abjection. It retains a kind of psychosocial dimension, it doesn't reject that. And it's a dynamic account. It's not just a fixed social constructionist account, but nevertheless it's one that tries to, partly like abject art has become perhaps institutionalised or became institutionalised. There's a sense in which I think abject theory became also solidified as a set of norms, and its attempt to refuse that. So the first chapter in the book in particular develops this new account of social objection. And it uses this account to then go through these revolts and rethink the meaning of objection and revolt in different situated and material contexts. So that means looking at the processes through which Minoritised populations are imagined and configured as revolting and become subject to control, stigma and censure, and the practices through which individuals and groups resist and reconfigure those processes of interpellation and revolt against a sort of abject subjectification. So as the kind of book itself, I began to understand as itself a kind of polemic, a bit like, in a way, its own strange work of art, perhaps, that attempts to move the reader towards a kind of revolt. And what I mean by that is I became aware that the way that I was writing the book was attempting to induce a kind of revulsion in the readers about the forms of disenfranchisement that I was describing, and an attempt to provoke sort of social action through writing. And that sounds like a very grand claim. I'm certainly not claiming that I managed to do that, but there's a real sense in which, as I wrote it, I became really aware, like I would upset myself writing it because I get so angry or moved by some of the materials that I was writing about. And these materials, some of them were based on interview data, and they were collected quite sociologically, and some of them were found, most of the majority were found materials, whether they were policy documents, political speeches, films, works of art, quite a vast archive of materials that I kind of knitted together to fabricate, to use the word someone's used today, these stories about revolt and resistance. So I think I became aware that, and perhaps I should give an example of how I do that and see if I could have moved you all to revolt today. But I became aware really that the book itself was engaging this third sense with the notion of revolt. So I'm kind of using revolt particularly on purpose, because, rather than disgust, because it has that political and dual meaning. And I became aware that the book was a little bit like a project of a group like ASGO, that it was an attempt to get others to look anew and think differently, both about a very particular set of circumstances, which are the circumstances of these groups in Britain today, but also more generally to rethink our notions of theories and histories of disgust and how we might engage in them and reverse and rework them. And in particular, the book is about the emergence of a kind of neoliberal consensus that there kind of is no alternative to the form of capitalism that we're living through, and to resist what Bauman has called the politics of disposability, which characterises contemporary life. Which brings me to the question, well, why revolt? For ASGO, why revolt? Perhaps if we'd asked them that, they would say, well, Vietnam, our friends are coming back in body bags, the police state, we get harassed on the streets, and members of our community are killed even in police violence when we protest. Environmental degradation, our communities are not only unequally and unfairly treated, because of state racism, but increasing the sort of car culture we live in has divided our communities. There might have been the reasons for ASGO, and in a way, a lot of those reasons still apply today. But there's something particularly turbulent about this moment in world history, with kind of different man-made catastrophes, I think, are merging, whether they're environmental, peak oil, terror and warfare, and of course global economic recession. And one consequence of these convergence of these disasters is that economic polarisation has reached unparalleled depths in terms of deepening inequalities within post-industrial states like in Europe and North America, but also in terms of the staggering inequalities which are newly visible, I think, that are really visible now between the global north and global south in a way that they wouldn't have been in the 60s and 70s. So this is really interesting to me about this time period, because today a lot of the work that we've looked at and thought about either emerged in the 70s or it's kind of more recent and is reworking almost or returning to some of that work from that period. And one of the things that I use in the book as a guide is Foucault's last lectures on the birth of biopolitics, where he starts to map in the late 70s the emergence of kind of neoliberal ideology. And he says one of the things that characterises neoliberalism is that instead of accepting a free market defined by the state and kept, as it were, under state supervision, which was, he says, the initial formula of liberalism, he says neoliberalism is about establishing a space of economic freedom, which the state is under, where the state is under the supervision of the market rather than a market supervised by the state. So there's that shift that he starts to track and develop in those lectures, which is really interesting. And what Foucault's talking about is a period after the Second World War when he describes the emergence of a kind of state-phobic consensus in Europe and North America. Because the horrors of Nazism and the decomposition of former communist states, he said, made politicians phobic of the idea of a big state. So a consensus emerges on the political left and the right that the state is the enemy of human freedom. And he says it's amidst this anxiety about the fascistic potential of big states that the deregulation and marketisation of the state is enabled. And he says what becomes the work of governments is to create the conditions in which the state can be penetrated by capital. So the idea is that the market can somehow stop those fascistic conditions from happening again. But what struck me when I was kind of looking at this for this lecture was how also that relates to the period in ASCO were working in LA. So the Foucault statement that one must govern for the market rather than because of the market, and how governments come to work against people for the market, and how that becomes the work of government, seem to also describe what happened post-war in LA when, for example, these big companies like General Motors were allowed to disseminate the kind of public culture and the street culture of a city like that. And what's important to remember is that the power of the state isn't shrunk in this process of marketisation. So the idea is that, well, the state can't be all powerful, and that's good because that'll protect human freedoms. But actually what happens is modes of surveillance and control hybridise and multiply under neoliberal government. Power doesn't shift from the state to the market, but it combines in the form of a new maxim. And the tentacles of government actually extend and disperse into every stratum of social and cultural life, working tirelessly to unblock impediments to capital and to deregulate resource extraction and to secure profits within a new global class of the super rich. So what I argue in the book is as governments have come to govern for the markets, they increasingly have come to govern against people. And Naomi Klein writes about this in terms of what you do. How do you get people to consent to that? So how do you get, for example, a country like Britain, an ostensibly democratic country, well, how do you get people to consent to a form of government that is going to, in effect, means that they lose their freedoms, democratic freedoms, that they're under mass surveillance, but also that the country becomes more unequal, which is what's happened in Britain since the 70s. And one of the things and she talks about, she describes that, and we can think of lots of examples that support that description. But what she doesn't answer, and what I attempt to answer in my book, is the central role that disgust comes to play in enabling that consent for the kind of neoliberal state statification that I've been describing. Okay. So a major characteristic of, I think, contemporary society is they function through the generation of fear and anxiety. Proliferation of fears about things like border controls and terror threats, fears around economic security and the job security. And these fears and anxieties are channeled towards scapegoats, which enable kind of consent for the changes to be made. So in Britain today, unemployed people, welfare recipients, and regular migrants are often targeted. And in the book I look at these figures change historically in different moments, but I turn these figures and their function, I turn them national abjects. And these national abjects become kind of enmeshed within the interpellative fabric of everyday life. But they also, and this is the bit that relates to the other part of revolt, not only give rise, if you are constantly the subject of somebody else's stigma, then that impacts on the sort of subject that you are. But also that means that it gives rise to forms of resistance. So in one sort of structural way, these abject figures become kind of conductors who you could argue are mobilised to do this sort of dirty work of neoliberal governmentality. So we let the bankers off the hook because we're all morally outraged about fake disabled benefit claimants. So they're symbolic and material scapegoats, but they also become a site of forms of resistance. Okay. So the kind of key argument of the book, thinking through theories of disgust and reworking them, is that a politics of disgust is a kind of modus operandi of neoliberal governmentality. And that in order to kind of resist this, we need to think the aesthetic and the political together. And that for me means thinking about things like the mediation of disgust and things like its effective qualities and impact. In order to think about how disgust works as a way of governing people, we need to think about those mechanisms much better and much more critically than we do at the moment. So, if we begin to map in any particular case the aesthetics of aversive emotions, we can begin to apprehend the way in which disgust is provoked, roused and excited in the service of particular social and political norms or classificatory systems. So what we know is that disgust, as Martha Nussbaum argues, has been used throughout history as a powerful weapon by the right, in particular in efforts to exclude certain groups and persons. And all political ideologies, of course, are preoccupied with social hygiene. We've talked about that already today. Racism, xenophobia, eugenics, homophobia and misogyny, they're all mediated through revolting aesthetics. And in a way, what I'm kind of describing is, well, what's the counter-politics to that? And how does that mobilise its own disgust and revulsion back? And where do those meet and what happens when they do? So how can artists, in particular, if we turn to the subject of today, respond to the kind of neoliberal politics of disgust that I've sketched out? And when I was thinking about examples to use for this venue, in the afterword of the book, I write about the Paralympic Games in London. And I kind of map out the kind of convergence in the Paralympic Games of corporate power and money and welfare reforms around disability, and the way in which disabled activists and artists began to kind of try and protest the Paralympics, to draw attention to what was happening to disabled people in their everyday lives. So one of the horrible paradoxes of the Paralympics is it was sponsored by a French-based corporation called Atos, who are a software company who the government outsourced the work of to reassess every disabled person in Britain's benefit entitlements. And there's huge scandals around the impact of this and the fairness of the processes that have happened as a consequence. And I wish I put some pictures of that up, but they staged really interesting sort of funerals to sort of try and memorialise the impact of those cuts in terms of actual lives and deaths that had happened as a consequence of these changes. So kind of, in a way, quite similar to when I was looking at Askos's work for this talk. I was quite interested in the way in which they went into public space and had to reclaim these spaces that was being taken, because London itself, of course, was massively securitized during the Olympics and Paralympic Games, with drones, with a kind of ring of steel around the city to protect it from terror, threats and protests, and the way in which they kind of resisted this securitization as protesters to kind of create this public awareness and to take back the street in order to dramatize the effect of these cuts. So they're a population who are being constituted as revolting in a history of disgust around disabled bodies that's being kind of drawn on in the kind of right-wing propaganda around disability fraud, benefit fraud. And so that there's a kind of whole sets of histories of eugenics around disability and disgust around disability around disabled bodies that then's been drawn on by the right-wing government that they're attempting then to restage to reveal its impact. But the example that I chose to show today was this sample of an artist, performance artist called Liz Crow, who did a project called Bedding Out in Bristol in 2013, actually, that's not right, it was this year, where she 48 hours where she performed her bed live. And she says, I wear a public self that is energetic, dynamic and happening, but I'm also ill and spend much of my life in bed. And she wants to kind of, just a very similar way to sort of consciousness raising amongst black and amongst feminist communities in the 60s and 70s to kind of make public this sort of private as a form of political action. And in the bedding out, she invited for 40 minutes a day people to come and sit and talk to her about disability hate crime, about cuts in welfare and the privatisation of hospitals and services, and the role that art could play in kind of intervening in these issues. And around 10,000 people in 50 countries could watch live the Bedding Out performance. So that was kind of one example of an attempt to kind of rework what I would describe as the neoliberal politics of disgust, to intervene on it in the level of a kind of individual art activist practice. And I was thinking a lot about this in the relationship from ASCO to today, and this kind of art activist interface that seemed very important to their work and seems also important to forms of art that are emerging at the moment. And what types of art interventions we're seeing around responding to this politics of disgust. And art as occupation seems a big theme. Art literally in the Occupy movement, but actually a real concern amongst artists to think about space and taking back space. And in the book I describe this in terms of kind of notions of commons, and art practices can very much play part in these practices of commoning. Art, as we've heard a lot about today, is also about the transgression of borders And those transgressions of borders reveal the border. So a lot of the time we don't know where the border is. So the re-performance or staging of something, like in Paul McCarthy's work, the disgusted response reveals a border. And it reveals a border that then tells us something about our own borders, but also very often about social and political borders. Art which appropriates and reworks negative affects that are circulating in culture and society as forms of political practice. And ASCO were really interested in these processes, it seemed to me, in their reworking of ritual and the reworking of things like the Day of the Dead celebrations, which they staged in the 70s as acts of resistance to both memorialise but protest the Vietnam War. And they seem very much to resonate, for me at least, with things like die-ins against welfare reforms. And I like this quote from Cronk from ASCO. It says, yeah, it's nausea, and it's like that's what we're doing nausea. So if you're made nauseous, you're made an object of disgust, how can you do nausea as a kind of form of practice to resist that? So people do revolt against the politics of disgust, often by precisely reworking their own objection. Objectified populations refuse and revolt against the disenfranchising effects of classification, their classification as disgusting. And kind of my hope in the book is by kind of trying to come up with this concept of social objection is to try and kind of get past that impasse a little bit between a kind of psychological or universal notion of disgust and a kind of social, political notion, and try and think them together, to think about the ways in which representational forms get inside people, instructing, correcting and regulating and shaping subjectivities, but also the ways in which people also resist that and create new forms of subjectivity through forms of political and artistic practice, and in an attempt to kind of remake themselves. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
That was great, thank you. When we were talking, I was wondering about the police agents provocateurs who join kind of lefty or not even left groups, kind of environmental, environmental groups, and then go rogue or whatever.
Yeah.
And the way in which that's always talked about in terms of contamination, and I just wondered if you could sort of say something about that.
The recent cases I know about that in Britain, where police, undercover surveillance police, have joined, so those who don't know, have joined environmental groups. So this happened over probably 15 years or longer. They become embedded in environmental protest groups and had children and relationships with activists, and then come out and, been exposed and written their stories. In those cases, I'm not sure that they describe it as going rogue exactly, because they don't kind of become environmental activists, do they? They become like deeply embedded in the groups, but they don't. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about that it raises, I suppose, if we're approaching your question, is how the effective relationship between activism and art for me. So it seems to me that effective political activism always has an aesthetic and kind of performance-related element, that the feeling of being involved, for example, in a big street protest, and also the placards, the materials, the kind of outfits that people wear, the songs that they sing, all of those things are about it's a form of belonging, which it creates either temporarily in the form of occupy or camp, or for longer in the terms of environmental protesters and those police who get turned or become part of those communities. It creates a kind of alternative community, doesn't it? So I think that's one thing that's interesting, is how those alternative communities become alternative sites, which are deeply aesthetic and affecting in some way. Not really answering your question, because I'm not sure if I need to talk to you afterwards about a case of someone who's come out the other end of that, become embedded and then turned. I can think of the soldiers where that's happened, where they've kind of become... the other side of embedding, of course, is the news reporting and the lack of a kind of free press.
Well, I think the most obvious example of kind of aesthetics and politics convening around Disgust was during the Republican hunger strikes.
Yes.
Where people were living in their own shit.
Exactly.
And speaking in their own shit.
Exactly, yeah.
And
yeah.
The way in which that transformed completely.
Yeah. Exactly.
The body and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, the dirty protests in the cells were exactly about that. But of course, they continue today, that they're much less represented, but they continue very much so in immigration detention centres, where there are protests, including dirty protests of that kind, but other types of protests, in particular hunger strikes, lip sewing, some forms of self-harm, etc., used precisely in a similar way as forms of to speak out against the sort of forms of disenfranchisement. But you can go back. There's other examples of that in history in Britain. Suffragettes, for example, where food became, and starvation became their kind of instrument for protesting the sexual politics of inequality.
Just firstly, I'd say that example is kind of a bit of a strange one, because it's a totally different idea of the public sphere within an institution than in the public that we're talking about here. I was really intrigued at the beginning when you were talking about the kind of dismissal of Kristeva and the broader kind of dismissal of the psychoanalytic that you're kind of working through. Just partly because the work that you're talking about here seems to me to relate much more firmly to AIDS activism, which I think we might get a chance to talk a little bit about tomorrow, but something which was absolutely embedded within kind of psychoanalytic thinking, and where all of these kinds of forms that you're talking about were able to be enacted, but with the psychoanalytic being an absolutely kind of social aspect of it. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about
absolutely.
that.
I'm not in any way dismissing, I'm reworking, I'm not dismissing.
I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about how you were doing that.
Well, one thing in particular that I am refusing, if you like, is a particular psychoanalytic narrative, which is, for her, the primary objection, for example, is the objection of the mother. So in order to be, she says, we have to commit a kind of psychic matricide, and that's a kind of Oedipal, and that's a scripting of the kind of Oedipal family at the centre of kind of psychoanalytic discourse. And what I would say to that, I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail about how I do that. I mean, I've written an essay about this called Against Objection, where I work through some of this, is say that actually that psychoanalytic discourse from Freud is a very conservative one that belongs to a different historical period. And it's not a kind of universal and totemic truth that transcends time and history. And the trouble with the way in which that script, or that universal psychoanalytic script, gets then re-scripted into kind of cultural theory and art theory, in the form of objection is it repeats some of that psychoanalytic story as a form of universal truth. And so what I do is bring actually, in particular, colonial history into play, into relationship to those psychoanalytic scripts, and say we need to rework our notion of objection, in particular through the work of Frantz Fanon, who works through kind of the colonial impact, the impact of colonialism on psychic life, and start to kind of have a much more historically dynamic notion of objection. So it's not that I've sort of trained in kind of psychoanalysis, because I went through critical theory training at a very particular age where we did Freud and Lacan and Althusser, and we worked our way through kind of all of that literature. And it's not that I want to reject it, and it's not that I want to get away from a theory of the subject. I don't, because I think it's useful to think about interiority, even if that's a kind of fiction. I think it's a useful one. But I want to question the usefulness of us believing in the universal applicability of a kind of Freudian and post-Freudian concept of the psychic life that's dependent on a kind of nuclear heterosexual family.
Judith Butler's kind of way of thinking through objection. Yeah, that's
I do use her too.
Interested in.
So the first chapter of the book, I kind of bring together post-colonial, Fanon, and a set of other theorists to kind of rework away from Kristova's work. And it's almost like you're not allowed to do that or something. So people are like, what do you mean? And it's like, but it actually